Today's Hebrew word of the day is Ananai Hachavad, cloud of glory. Do you ever feel like God is far away from you or from a situation you're facing? Do you ever feel like God is silent right at the time you need him the most? Do you ever feel like your prayers are going unanswered? Whenever I feel like this, I remind myself that when the Israelites were in the desert for 40 years, God sent a cloud of glory to shelter them. The Jewish rabbis called this cloud the Ananai Hachavad, which literally means cloud of glory. Inside this cloud, God provided for his people and kept them safe. Inside the cloud, God made his people aware of his presence and sustained them. Scientists will tell you that clouds are made from vapor, and the rabbi would teach that the Ananai Hachavad was made from the vapor that came out of the mouths of the nation of Israel as they called out to the Lord of the desert. What an incredible image. I believe that today, whatever you're facing, God wants you to be reminded that he is with you too. I believe God wants you to know that he is able to provide for you, to protect you, to sustain you, and to keep you safe, no matter what you're facing. All you need is to call out to him. This was a reading from 52 Hebrew Words Every Christian Should Know by Dave Adamson, published by Christian Art Gifts. You can purchase this on Amazon, or you can contact Christian Art Gifts at their website. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. I am Paige, your caffeine-imbued host. Here's my caffeine. In the beginning, coffee. Lo, it was very good. All right, we are going to continue our journey in Romans. We're in chapter 4. We're going to look at 16 and 17 today. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that the reason I do these podcasts isn't for the vast audience out there eagerly awaiting every one that I do, because that audience doesn't exist. This is a Paige taking care of Paige thing. In Psalms 1, it says, "Blessed is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and in it he meditates day and night. He'll be like a tree planted by streams of living water." It's my way of making Paige better today than he was yesterday in my pursuit of God. My podcasts are more musings than they are an academic approach to Romans. I am an academic. I have 2 master's degrees, but I don't have one in theology. So there's a lot in Romans that, frankly, I consider above my pay grade. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't consider it. I shouldn't consider them. That doesn't mean I shouldn't study Romans, because Romans has a lot to tell me about me. And that's what you're getting with my podcasts. You're looking in through a window into my own little house and watching me decluttering and cleaning up Paige. So join with me, if you will. If you get anything from it, God's blessings to you. I'm overjoyed. But so let's just get started. We're going to start with recapping Romans 4 to this point, part 1. And as we step back and look at Romans 4 as a whole, Paul is doing something much bigger than simply talking about Abraham's personal faith. He's reaching deep into Israel's story and making a radical point about where God's covenant family truly begins. Paul takes us all the way back before Mount Sinai, before Moses, even before the law itself. He anchors God's saving plan in something earlier and deeper, God's promise. Here's why that matters. Abraham was declared righteous in Genesis 15. The law wasn't given until Exodus 19, hundreds of years later. That timeline's everything for Paul's argument. If Abraham was counted righteous before circumcision and before the law even existed, then righteousness cannot ultimately be based on the law or Torah observance. It never was. The law did not create God's covenant family. The law did not initiate the promise. The law did not generate righteousness. The covenant family was born through promise, received through faith. That's Paul's point. When God told Abraham, "So shall your offspring be," Abraham believed him, and that believing response became the defining marker of belonging, not ritual, not ethnicity, not possession of the law, faith. So when Paul says the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and guaranteed, he's protecting the very structure of God's covenant plan. Because if the promise depended on Torah observance, then it would only belong to those under Sinai. It would depend on human performance. It would operate more like wages earned than a gift received. But if the promise rests on faith, everything changes. Now the promise reaches beyond ethnic boundaries. Now Jew and Gentile can belong together. Now grace is magnified instead of human merit. And Paul's not attacking the law as if it were evil. He's repositioning it within the larger story. The law reveals sin. It exposes humanity's need for rescue. But Sinai is not the foundation of the covenant story. It's one chapter within that story. Here's the foundation. God makes a promise. God creates people through that promise. And these people enter that promise by trusting the one who promises. That's why Abraham can become the father of us all, because a covenant family was never ultimately defined by possession of the Torah. It was defined by trust in the God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence things that don't yet exist. In other words, the covenant was relational before it was regulatory. It was promise-based before it was law-structured. And it was faith-defined before it was boundary-marked. And once you see that, it reshapes the entire book of Romans. Because if covenant identity is rooted in faith rather than the Torah, then the door to God's family has always been wider than Sinai. All right, we're going to take a little break. I'm going to tell you about a friend of mine, and we'll come back to part 2 where Paul continues his argument. This podcast is sponsored by Up and Away Junk Hauling, a Christian-owned and operated junk removal service serving the Atlanta area. They offer white-collar service in a blue-collar industry, fair prices, and no-cost estimates, with a commitment to donate and recycle whenever possible. Book online at upandawayjunk.com or call 404-909-4183. Ask for Taylor. He's the owner and a friend of mine. Up and Away Junk Hauling, helping lighten your load. And now let's return to Romans with Paige, our host. My thanks to Taylor. He's a good friend, and he has worked for me a couple times in the past. Good man to call. Good man to know. All right, let's continue on with part 2, where we get into verses 16. Therefore, and whenever you see the word therefore, as an old preacher told me, look before that verse to see what that verse is there for. So when Paul says therefore, he's saying, as a result of all that we've just discussed, he goes on to say, the promise comes by faith. So that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. So Paul's word, therefore, connects back to his earlier conclusion in verse 13. The promise that Abraham would be the heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. I love what the Reformation Bible says about this. Because the promise in all its elements is received by faith, it also rests on grace. Had it been on the basis of works, the promise would have failed. Had it been on the basis of circumcision, it could have only been received by Jews. But because it's by faith, and therefore by grace, by God's action, not man's, it is guaranteed to come to Abraham's true spiritual offspring, or all believers, whether Jew or Gentile by birth. Remember that Paul has already laid the groundwork for this conclusion. He has shown that if inheritance were tied to the law, the entire structure would give way under its own weight. The law, by its very nature, does not secure promise. It exposes transgression. Instead of guaranteeing inheritance, it highlights failure. And if the covenant depended on human performance, then its fulfillment would always hang in uncertainty, resting on the fragile obedience of mankind rather than steadfast faithfulness of God. So, Paul draws the inevitable conclusion. If the promise is going to stand, if it is going to be secure, reliable, and unshakable, then it must rest on something other than the law. It must be grounded not in human achievement, but in a foundation strong enough to uphold it. Paul says, therefore the promise comes by faith. Well, faith safeguards the very nature of a promise. A promise, by definition, rests on the character and capability of the one who makes it. Its fulfillment depends on the promiser's integrity, not on the performance of the one who receives it. If the covenant were structured around law keeping, it would begin to function like wages earned rather than a gift given. Its outcome would hinge on human success. And with that would come constant uncertainty, because human obedience is never flawless. Faith changes the center of gravity. It shifts the weight away from human effort and places it squarely on God. Faith simply says, I trust the promiser. And in doing so, it keeps the covenant anchored where it belongs, not in fragile human merit, but in the steady, unchanging faithfulness of God. Paul goes on to say, so that it may be by grace. Grace means that the covenant begins with God and continues because of God. He is the one who initiates it. He is the one who sustains it. Nothing in its origin or fulfillment is triggered by human achievement. Faith, therefore, is not a means of earning the promise. It is the open hand that receives what grace freely gives. Paul is carefully guarding the Abrahamic covenant from being reduced to a merit-based contract. If the promise were something earned, it could no longer be a promise. It would be payment, as I've already said. But the covenant with Abraham did not begin with human qualification. It began with divine initiative. Because it began in grace, it must also be received in a way that reflects grace. And that way is faith, trusting the God who gives, rather than striving to deserve what he has promised. Another way of looking at it is to say that our faith isn't in a God who owes us, because he owes us nothing. Faith is not our confidence in what we have been able to accomplish in our lives. In truth, we've done nothing worth observing. We stand in front of the judge of all with nothing to bring in our defense. Our faith is best demonstrated by our refusal to defend ourselves, letting the judge judge. Let me say that again. Our faith is best demonstrated by our refusal to defend ourselves, letting the judge judge. Only then is grace truly grace. Paul goes on to say that the promise comes by faith so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring. One of the most striking words in this passage is guaranteed. Its weight cannot be overstated. If inheritance depended on the law, it would always hang by a thread. Human failure would nullify it because no one can meet the law perfectly. The promise would be fragile, constantly threatened by our imperfections. But when the promise rests on grace and is received through faith, everything changes. Its certainty no longer depends on human effort. It rests entirely on God's faithfulness. Its reliability is anchored in the unchanging character of the one who made it. The promise stands firm because God himself stands firm. Faith secures the promise, not by human merit, but by trusting in a God who is perfectly faithful. That's Powerful stuff. All right, we're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to look at part 3, and we're going to discuss who are really Abraham's offspring. I'll be right back. Hi, go to Amazon.com, do a search on Essays in Romans by Paige C. Garwood, and you will find several books there in this series, each book assigned to a chapter. So far, there are 3 chapters published, and they contain the script of these podcasts plus study questions to help you follow along. They would be a good addition to this podcast. All right. Be sure to get those study guides and come check me out at www.coffeeBiblePage.com. All right, part 3. Who are Abraham's offspring? Because Paul says all this stuff he's been talking about is for all of Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. Paul shifts the question of identity here. Who truly belongs to Abraham's family? He makes it clear. Abraham's offspring are not limited to Jews under Sinai, those bound by the law. They also include Gentiles, anyone who shares in Abraham's faith. The defining mark of covenant membership is no longer the possession of Torah or ethnic lineage. It is participation in faith. Abraham becomes father not merely by descent, but by covenant, a spiritual and relational father to all who trust God as he did. Paul then turns to Scripture, quoting Genesis 17, where God tells Abraham, I have made you a father of many nations. The tense of God's declaration is striking. He says, I have made. It's a done deal. It's set in stone. He pronounced Abraham a father of many nations before Isaac was even born, long before Israel existed as a nation. From the very beginning, the promise carried a global scope. The inclusion of Gentiles is not a later theological innovation or adjustment. It's the fulfillment of the covenant that God had always intended. What is important, at least to me anyway, is that Paul is not redefining anything. He's not, as some today proclaim, creating Christianity in his own image. He is affirming the core truths of the theology he presents, that is, we're saved by grace through faith, as something old, not as something new. Paul says it was always meant to be this way. From Abraham to now, God's grace, justification, all of it applies to Jew and Gentile. Paul now turns to the God to whom Abraham placed his trust, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that are not. This is the language of resurrection, a power that transforms the impossible into reality. Abraham faced circumstances that seemed hopeless. His own body was as good as dead. Sarah's womb was barren, and the future looked biologically impossible. Yet God spoke life into that impossibility. The promise did not depend on human ability or natural capacity, but on divine power. Abraham believed in a God who gives life, a life-giving God whose power can make the impossible come to pass. The grace of God isn't just reserved for our future judgment before his throne. For Abraham and Sarah, there was an immediate infusion of joy in the arrival of Isaac. Grace is for the here and now, as well as the future. I've experienced the here and now version of God's grace. Over 20 years ago, I went through a very dark time, caused solely by my own foolishness. I deserved destruction, yet God delivered my family and me. And today I'm in a very good place because God was gracious, not because I was wise enough to find a solution. Grace has eternal consequences, yes, but it has present tense implications as well. We live in God's grace. All right, one little pause more, and then I'm going to come back and wrap this up with part 4, the larger covenant picture. head over to www.coffeebiblepage.com and find links to all the podcast episodes I have done since 2021. I think you will like what you find. My goal is that by the end of 2029 or so, that I will have done a commentary or personal Bible study on every book in the New Testament. So join me on the journey. Coffee, the Bible and Page. Thinking with my mouth open. Okay, part 4, the larger covenant picture. Paul's words here do more than recount the miraculous birth of Isaac. They point forward to the reality of resurrection. The same God who brought life to Abraham's aged body and caused Sarah's barren womb to bear a child is a God who would later raise Jesus from the dead, give life to sinners who were spiritually dead, and one day raise the dead at the final resurrection. From the very beginning, the Abrahamic promise was shaped by resurrection power. That's why it must be received by faith, because only a God who can bring life from death can fulfill what he's promised. Romans 4:16 through 17 lays out several foundational truths about God's covenant. Membership in the covenant family is grounded in faith, not in law or human effort or ethnicity. Grace secures the promise and God's own faithfulness to the promise. He made guarantees. From the very beginning, the covenant family was meant to be multinational. And the power of resurrection underlies the entire structure. This is not abstract individualism. Paul is speaking of a family, an inheritance, a future, a people created and sustained by God's promise. Abraham trusted a life-giving God. And that trust became the defining mark of the covenant community. It's not confined to Israel, but circles the globe. I used to think that having faith in God was falling off a cliff and reaching out to grab the only branch available to keep from plunging to my death. According to Paul, though, the branch reached out and grabbed me. I know that sounds foolish, but in truth, I in my sin do not see the branch to grab it. God grabbed me. God saved me. That is grace extended to me by God. It's an imperfect example, I know, but after all the last 50 years of calling him Lord, that's the closest I can come to describing my salvation. I wasn't looking, yet he found me. Grace. I bowed my knee, knowing my sentence was death. And rather than trying to defend myself, I put myself entirely at his mercy. Faith. That's an imperfect description of it, I'm sure. But it's one that is still, even after these 50 years, it's still unfolding in my life. I'm still now recognizing the beauty, the grace, and the depth of God's grace and the faith that I am able to believe in the one who saved me. It's a mystery to me. Much of it is. But of this I'm sure. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. Amazing grace. Well, I'm Paige. Here's my coffee, and I'm out of here. Have a glorious day. Bye-bye. You have been watching or listening to Coffee, the Bible, and Paige with your host, Paige C. Garwood, thinking with his mouth open since Noah was tarring the ark.